Good morning, everyone. Today is October 28th, 2019, and here is today's relatively short Monday Morning Minute. So because we did not have a critical response due last week, we're going to jump right into our preview of this week's readings, and then I'll talk about this week's assignment, which is our 8th critical response, and that is it. So this week we're looking very broadly at the topic of effective, appropriate communication. And we start with chapter 9 from the Emmer and Evertson textbook, which is about maintaining appropriate student behavior. And this doesn't deal as directly with communication as chapter 10, but I think we can still see in this chapter the ways in which communication is implicated. So be thinking about that and kind of the connections between chapters 9 and 10 as you read. And in chapter 9, there are two main kind of pillars of important takeaways that I want you to be thinking about as you read. The first is that they talk about the importance of maintaining appropriate student behavior in the context of also monitoring student behavior to make sure that it is appropriate. And they start off by saying that it might be hard to maintain this behavior if we don't know what it is exactly that we're looking for. So to that end, they give two pieces of advice. When you're monitoring student behavior, we're looking for, first of all, student involvement in learning activities. And second of all, student compliance with classroom rules and procedures. And they go into depth about both of these. And again, I find that it might be, or I'm thinking that it might be helpful for those of us, again, just so we know what we're looking for when we enter a classroom. And secondly, they offer up the importance of consistency when we are thinking about maintaining appropriate student behavior. Are we consistent in, first of all, what we say our goals are and our methods of achieving those goals? So we can think about this, first of all, at the classroom level. Are we consistent in maintaining a positive climate? But we can also zoom out and think about our schools, our buildings. Are the schools that we're at consistent in maintaining school-wide positive behavioral support systems? Are they used kind of unilaterally and equitably across a school site? And then finally, we can think about consistency as we zoom even further out and think about support for social emotional learning K through 12, K through 16 even, right? Again, so these are things to think about. I'm curious, I'm sure some of us might have experiences thinking about both examples where consistency has been achieved and its positive effects, and also maybe examples where we haven't been consistent and some negative consequences sometimes arise. So moving on to chapter 10, again, this deals much more directly with our theme this week, communication skills for teaching. And the authors go over 3 essential skills for effective communication in some depth. The first of which is constructive assertiveness. Our authors point out that assertiveness is, a sort of firmness that is derived from the legitimacy of the complaint. And it kind of is between the poles of, extreme aggressiveness on one end and timidity on the other. It's kind of in between, which I think is really helpful to think about and to visualize. They also point out that constructive means building students up and not tearing students down, which can be sometimes the gut reaction when students disobey our instructions as educators, right? So they, again, go into depth about this. The second essential skill that they talk about is empathic responding. They even describe very specific listening skills that educators can practice and that can really, really help resolve conflicts. And then finally, they talk about problem solving. So how to reach a mutually agreeable solution to a persistent problem. And they note, critically, I think, that in addition to being useful with students, these 3 skills, they're also really useful when we're talking with parents and family members. So kind of keep that in your mind too, and think about how constructive assertiveness might look when you're dealing with a student and with a parent. Are those the same? Would those be different? An interesting intellectual exercise. And I also wanted to touch on something that is only dealt with briefly in chapter 10. I wish that it was kind of more of a foundational, topic. In my view, culturally responsive communication is sort of the foundation from which we're thinking about effective communication. But that's my gripe. And that aside, I'm glad that it's mentioned at all. So please pay special attention when you come to this section at the very end of the chapter. And so the authors write here with regard to culturally responsive communication. When teachers work with students from backgrounds different from their own, lack of understanding of the student's culture can hamper their communication with both the students and their parents. They give several very clear examples where the culture of a student is misaligned with the culture of the school and the culture perhaps of the teacher themselves. I want you to think also about maybe less obvious ways in which there are cultural mismatches between some students from various cultural backgrounds and the school. In my mind, a lot of the conflicts that we see in schools are due to cultural mismatches, even if it's not as obvious as some of the examples that they give. So for this week, we have our 8th critical response. Our initial post will be due Thursday on Halloween. Happy Halloween. And then we have 2 follow-up posts due on Sunday, November 11th. Already November. I've provided an optional prompt this week for your critical response number 8 in case it's interesting to you. And for this, I'm going to ask you to analyze the dialogue 10.2. It's called Alice and Alicia, and it's on page 208 of our E&E textbook. And after reading this dialogue carefully, kind of line by line, maybe make some annotations, I want to know where you see the teacher employing some of the strategies that are discussed in chapter 10. Also, how might this teacher's approach be improved? I think it's intended as a positive model, and in many ways it is, but I know we can also think critically and figure out ways to make it even better. And then finally, what kinds of culturally responsive considerations might this teacher take into account? What seems relevant? And this will be, I think, mostly conjecture on your part because the dialogue is very kind of sparse in terms of context. But again, just kind of thinking about those culturally responsive considerations and how they inform our interactions with students might be a useful exercise. Thank you all so much for your time and attention and general awesomeness. I will see you back here next week.